Now, a massive Russian drone strike targeted Ukraine's Kharkiv, hitting civilian infrastructure and residential areas.
And this happened as Moscow and Kiev trade blame for strikes endangering their truce efforts. At least 4 fires broke out after the drone strike in Kharkiv, with the largest one engulfing an industrial building. Preliminary reports indicated that at least 9 people were injured, though the toll may rise. Emergency services, including firefighters, police, medics and utility crews, rushed to the scene, working to contain the damage and assist victims.
This as the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the United States will examine Russia's requested conditions for agreements with Ukraine, but cautioned that a peace deal will take time.
To end a war where people are dying. And I think everyone should be happy that the United States is engaged in a process of ending a war and bringing about peace. It's not going to be easy. It won't be simple. It'll take some time. But at least we're on that road and we're talking about these things. And we're going to test it and see what's possible.
Russia and Ukraine agreed in parallel separate talks with U.S. envoys in Saudi Arabia to halt strikes in the Black Sea. But the Kremlin said that a revival of a deal on the Black Sea was subject to a number of conditions and that Russia was discussing sanctions relief with the U.S.
Now, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy expressed hope that the U.S. has enough power to press Russia into an unconditional ceasefire. At a joint press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris, Zelenskyy said sanctions against Russia should remain in place and be strengthened.
Let's hope and believe that the U.S. has enough power to press Russian President Vladimir Putin into an unconditional ceasefire. Sanctions against Russia should remain in place and strengthen as long as the Russian occupation continues.
French President Emmanuel Macron renewed the call on Russia to accept a 30-day ceasefire without conditions and said that it was too early to consider lifting sanctions. He warned that Russia was still showing a desire for war despite efforts to forge a ceasefire.
In Jeddah, on March 11th, Ukraine clearly expressed its agreement to the United States for a complete ceasefire without preconditions for a period of 30 days, even though it is the one being victimized by aggression. We expect the same commitment from Russia.
Macron spoke after talks with Ukraine's president and ahead of a summit in Paris of some 30 nations on Thursday that will discuss the proposed European armed force for Ukraine that the French president suggested could be deployed in important towns and elsewhere to respond to a Russian attack.
Meanwhile, the UN called for more aid for Ukraine during a Security Council meeting, applauding separate agreements the US struck with Ukraine and Russia to pause their strikes in the Black Sea and against each other's energy targets.
The war must end. We must all continue to agree on this. The United States commends Ukraine and the Russian Federation for taking the first steps towards a ceasefire, including participating in technical level talks this week. We welcome the proposed partial ceasefires on strikes against energy infrastructure and in the Black Sea, agreed to in principle by the leaders of both sides.
Now, the UN and Turkey brokered the Black Sea Initiative between Russia and Ukraine in July 2022 to allow the safe export of Ukrainian grain. Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Initiative in July 2023, complaining that its food and fertilizer exports face serious obstacles. Now, for more on this, a correspondent Susan Tehrani has sent us this report from New York. Listen to this.
On Wednesday, here at the United Nations, the Security Council held an open briefing on the worsening humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya reported a sharp rise in civilian casualties and detailed severe violations against children in Russian-occupied areas. Meanwhile, diplomatic momentum is building after the United States brokered a maritime ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine to secure safe passage in the Black Sea and halt strikes on energy infrastructure. However, it appears that violations continue and Russia is tying the deal's implementation to sanctions relief, prompting criticism from President Zelenskyy of Ukraine. Council members broadly welcomed this ceasefire effort, but stressed that Ukraine should be involved on all future negotiations when it comes to its future or any peace talks. And they also demanded accountability for attacks on civilians. Now, media reports indicate that President Trump's administration is aiming to secure a full ceasefire by the 20th of April. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.